On the night of August 13th, 1979, during the Fastnet race off the southern coast of Ireland, the Irish Sea turned into a graveyard. A Force 10 storm, gusting past 60 knots, slammed into a fleet of 300 racing yachts. Masts snapped like matchsticks. Hulls were rolled and battered by 40-foot waves. By dawn, 15 sailors were dead, 24 boats had been abandoned, and 5 had sunk to the bottom of the Celtic Sea. The boats that failed were not cheap. They were not poorly built. They were some of the most advanced racing yachts in the Western world, designed by the best naval architects money could buy. And yet, in the chaos of that storm, their engineering turned against them. A single corroded fitting, a fatigued wire, a cracked pin no bigger than your thumb. That was all it took to bring an entire 60-foot mast, along with hundreds of kilos of wire and sailcloth, crashing through the deck. Now here is what makes this story interesting. Over 1,000 years before anyone drew the blueprints for those doomed yachts, Chinese shipbuilders, working along the rivers and coastlines of the Tang and Song dynasties, had already engineered a sailing rig that was designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophe. Not by being stronger, not by being faster, but by being smarter. This is the story of how an ancient technology, born on the waterways of medieval China, quietly solved problems that modern Western engineering is still struggling with today. 1. The high-tension time bomb. Walk into any marina from Sydney to San Francisco, and you will see the same thing: a forest of tall, slender aluminium masts. This is the Bermuda rig, the undisputed standard of modern sailing for nearly a century. It looks elegant, it performs beautifully in light wind, and it is, by any honest engineering analysis, a disaster waiting to happen. A modern mast cannot stand up by itself. It is held in place by a complex web of stainless steel wires, shrouds on the sides, a forestay pulling forward, a backstay pulling aft, and a series of rigid spreaders pushing outward at each level. This is called standing rigging. Before a single gust of wind touches the sails, these wires are cranked down to enormous tension. The shrouds pull upward on the edges of the hull. The mast pushes downward on the keel. The entire boat is locked in a permanent state of compression, roughly the equivalent of parking a small car on top of the keel, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whether you are sailing or sitting in port. Over time, this constant load causes invisible damage: deck delamination, cracked structural bulkheads, and slow fatigue in the hull itself. But the real danger is not the slow decay. It is the catastrophic failure mode. Engineers call the Bermuda rig a series system. That means every single component in the chain must work perfectly for the mast to stay up. If just one part fails, a corroded swage terminal hidden inside a turnbuckle, a fatigued wire strand you cannot see, a cracked chain plate buried under the deck, the entire structure collapses. Not slowly, not with warning, instantaneously. One $20 stainless steel pin fails, and a $50,000 rig comes crashing down into the sea. This is not a theoretical risk. In the 2015 Rolex Fastnet race, multiple modern yachts lost their rigs in heavy weather. The masts did not break because the wind overpowered them. They fell because one tiny fitting at the base of the chain reached its fatigue limit, and the whole system came apart in seconds. The boat goes from fully powered to completely helpless in the time it takes to blink. So here is the question that should bother every sailor alive. If the modern rig is this fragile, what was the alternative? And why did it take us so long to notice? 2. The principle that bamboo taught Chinese engineers. To understand the Chinese solution, you first have to understand bamboo. If you have ever watched bamboo in a typhoon, you have seen something extraordinary. The wind bends it nearly to the ground. The entire stalk arcs over at an angle that would snap an oak tree in half. And then, When the gust passes, the bamboo springs back upright, completely undamaged. It survives not by resisting the storm, but by yielding to it. Chinese shipbuilders understood this principle at a structural level centuries before Western engineers had a word for it. Archaeological evidence from the Quanzhou shipwreck, a southern Song dynasty trading vessel discovered in 1974 and dated to around 1277, reveals a hull construction so advanced that it stunned modern naval architects. The ship featured 13 watertight bulkhead compartments, iron fastenings, and a hull design optimized for the open ocean. And the rig it carried was a fully developed, unstayed, freestanding mast system, what we now call the Chinese junk rig. The junk rig operates on a completely different structural philosophy from anything in the Western tradition. There are no wires, no shrouds, no stays, no turnbuckles, no spreaders. The mast is a single freestanding pole, historically made of ironwood, teak, or composite bamboo, and today often built from carbon fiber or aluminum, that is stepped deeply into a massive socket at the keel. Instead of working as a compression column that tries to punch through the bottom of the boat, the junk mast works as a cantilevered beam. When a gust hits the sails, the mast does something a modern Bermuda mast is never permitted to do. It bends, sometimes 10 degrees or more. It flexes like a fishing rod under load, absorbing the chaotic energy of the wind and converting violent shocks into gentle, distributed stress. Because there are no high-tension wires, there are no hidden failure points. There is no single corroded pin that can bring the whole system down. The junk mast is allowed to lose the small battles, bending, flexing, spilling excess wind, so the boat wins the war. Where the Bermuda rig says, "Hold fast or die," the junk rig says, "Bend and live." But keeping the mast standing is only half the fight. When a storm hits, the sail itself becomes the next battlefield. And here, the Chinese solution reveals something even more surprising. 3. Submarine logic in the sky. In 1998, the Sydney to Hobart yacht race became one of the deadliest in sailing history. A massive storm slammed into the fleet with 60-knot winds and 30-foot breaking seas. 6 sailors died, 5 boats sank, and across the fleet, dozens of modern mainsails were ripped apart in seconds. The failure mode is predictable, and it is devastating. A modern mainsail is a single continuous membrane, one enormous sheet of Dacron or laminate stretched across hundreds of square feet. It is a beautifully efficient aerodynamic wing. It is also one giant point of failure. When a tiny tear starts at a stress point, a grommet, a seam, a batten pocket, the load instantly redistributes to the surrounding fabric. The cloth overstresses. The tear accelerates. A 6-inch rip becomes a 6-foot rip in under 10 seconds. You lose 100% of your sail area in a single catastrophic event. Now consider a principle that Chinese engineers had mastered by the 2nd century AD, over 1,000 years before the West adopted it. Watertight bulkhead compartmentalization. By the time of the Han Dynasty, Chinese shipbuilders were already dividing their hulls into sealed, independent compartments, separated by heavy transverse walls. If one compartment flooded, from a collision, a rock, or battle damage, the water was physically trapped. It could not spread to the neighboring sections. The ship stayed afloat. Marco Polo, visiting China in the late 13th century, described these compartments with astonishment. European shipbuilders would not widely adopt the same technology until the 19th century, after the Titanic disaster forced the issue into public consciousness. The Chinese junk sail applies this exact same survival logic, but to the wind instead of the water. A junk sail is not a single membrane. It is divided into multiple horizontal panels, and each panel is separated by a heavy, rigid batten, traditionally made of bamboo or hardwood, running the full width of the sail. These battens are structural walls. If a violent gust tears a hole in one panel, the damage physically cannot spread past the batten above or below it. The panels on either side of the tear keep their shape, maintain their tension, and continue driving the boat forward. Instead of losing your entire engine in one catastrophic rip, you lose perhaps 15% of your sail area. The boat keeps moving. The modern offshore sailor, Roger Taylor, proved this in the most dramatic way possible. In 2006, Taylor sailed his 27-foot junk-rigged sloop, Ming Ming, into the extreme northern latitudes of the Arctic, past 70 degrees north. During the voyage, the stitching on one of his sail panels failed in heavy weather. On a modern yacht, this would be a serious emergency, requiring industrial repair equipment or a rescue call. Taylor simply lowered the sail a few feet, lashed 2 of the bamboo battens together with rope to seal off the damaged panel, and continued his 3,000-mile voyage through the ice. He fixed it himself at sea with his bare hands and a piece of line. So the junk rig can survive damage that would cripple a modern sail. But what about the most terrifying moment in offshore sailing? The moment when you have to reduce sail in the middle of the night, alone in a storm. 4. The 3 a.m. test. Every experienced offshore sailor has a version of this nightmare. It is 3 in the morning. The rain is horizontal. Visibility is 0. The wind has just jumped from 20 knots to 35, and the boat is being overpowered. You need to reef, reduce the size of your sail, before the boat is knocked flat or the rig is destroyed. On a modern Bermuda-rigged yacht, reefing in heavy weather is one of the most dangerous things a sailor can do. First, you usually have to turn the boat head to wind, steering directly into the crashing waves, which kills your forward momentum and leaves you wallowing broadside in the troughs. Then you or your crew have to leave the safety of the cockpit and crawl forward onto a violently pitching, wave-swept deck. You are releasing high-tension lines, grinding heavy winches, and wrestling with hundreds of square feet of dacron that is flogging and snapping in the wind like a giant whip. The noise alone is deafening. One mistake, one slip on the wet deck, one line released at the wrong moment, can send a person overboard into black water. This is not abstract. Crew overboard incidents during reefing are one of the leading causes of death in offshore sailing. Now, here is what happens on a junk-rigged boat in the same 35-knot squall. The solo sailor does not leave the cockpit. They do not turn the boat into the wind. They do not touch a winch. They reach over and release one single rope, the halyard. Gravity does the rest. Because the junk sail is weighted with heavy bamboo battens, it falls immediately. The battens drop neatly into a network of guide ropes called lazy jacks, and the sail folds itself into a compact stack, like a set of Venetian blinds closing. It takes 5 to 10 seconds. One hand, 0 winches. And because the rigid battens hold the fabric flat as it descends, the sail never flogs. It never whips. It simply drops in near silence. One cruiser who switched from a Bermuda rig to a junk rig after decades of ocean sailing, Annie Hill, the British sailor and author of Voyaging on a Small Income, described the difference in terms that every offshore sailor understands. She wrote that on her previous boats, reefing was always an emergency, something done in crisis mode with adrenaline and fear. On the junk rig, it was so unremarkable she sometimes forgot she had done it. While European sailors during the Age of Sail were sending men aloft on 100-foot masts in freezing gales to wrestle with wet canvas, a job so dangerous that falling from the rigging was the single most common cause of death in the Royal Navy, Chinese sailors on junks had been reefing from the deck with one hand for centuries. The technology existed, the West simply never adopted it. But there is another killer hiding on modern yachts, one so common that even experienced sailors live in fear of it, and the junk rig neutralizes it with pure geometry. 5. The geometry that stops the killer. The accidental jibe is one of the most feared events in offshore sailing, and one of the leading causes of serious injury and death at sea. Here is how it happens. When a modern yacht sails downwind, the boom, a heavy aluminium or carbon tube that can weigh 30 to 80 pounds, swings far out to one side. The entire mainsail is behind the mast, held open by this boom like a giant door on a hinge. If the wind shifts even slightly or the helmsman makes a small steering error, the wind catches the wrong side of the sail. Instantly, the boom whips across the cockpit at speeds that can exceed 40 miles per hour. There is no warning. If your head is in the path, it can fracture your skull, knock you unconscious, or sweep you into the sea. Modern sailors use a whole arsenal of devices to prevent this. Boom brakes, preventers, running backstays, constant vigilance. But the risk never fully goes away because the fundamental geometry of the Bermuda rig creates the problem in the first place. The mast is a hinge. The boom is a long lever arm. All the sail area is behind the pivot point. When the wind catches it wrong, all that force accelerates the boom in one violent direction with nothing to slow it down. The Chinese junk rig eliminates this problem entirely through a configuration called the balanced lug. On a junk sail, approximately 15 to 25% of the sail area sits forward of the mast. When an accidental jibe occurs and the wind catches the back of the sail, pushing it across the boat, it simultaneously catches the forward portion, which pushes in the opposite direction. This forward area acts as a built-in aerodynamic brake. Instead of whipping across the cockpit like a baseball bat, the junk sail swings over slowly and gently, so slowly that you could stop it with one outstretched hand. Sailors call this soft jibing. It is one of those engineering solutions so elegant that it seems obvious in hindsight. The Chinese did not add a device to prevent the problem. They designed the problem out of existence. So the junk rig is safer to reef, safer in a jibe, safer when a sail tears, and safer when the wind overpowers the boat. But is this just theory? Or has it been tested in the most extreme conditions history could throw at it? 6. The voyages that proved it. In 1405, the Ming Dynasty Admiral Zheng He departed Nanjing with a fleet that dwarfed anything Europe would assemble for another century. His flagship, according to contemporary Chinese sources, was over 400 feet long, roughly 4 times the length of the Santa Maria that Columbus would sail across the Atlantic 87 years later. The fleet carried 27,000 men, and it was powered entirely by the junk rig. Over 7 voyages, spanning nearly 3 decades, Zheng He's treasure fleets crossed the South China Sea, navigated the Strait of Malacca, traversed the Indian Ocean, and reached the coast of East Africa. They sailed through the most dangerous monsoon seasons on Earth, the same storms that routinely destroyed European ships attempting the same waters centuries later. The fleet survived not because they avoided storms, but because their rigs were designed to absorb them. But perhaps the most remarkable test case came 4 centuries later. In December 1846, a traditional Chinese ocean-going junk named the Qiying departed Hong Kong with a mixed crew of Chinese and British sailors on one of the most audacious voyages of the 19th century. She sailed south through the Java Sea, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the entire Atlantic, and arrived in New York Harbor in July 1847, a voyage of over 18,000 miles. From New York, she crossed the Atlantic again to London, where she was exhibited on the Thames and visited by Queen Victoria. During the Atlantic crossing, the Qiying was caught in a full-blown hurricane. The British officers aboard, experienced Royal Navy men who had sailed Western ships through the same waters, were astonished. The Qiying's junk rig handled the storm with a composure they had never witnessed on a Western vessel. Captain Charles Kellett later recorded that the junk's ability to weather heavy seas matched or surpassed anything built by the British Admiralty. And then there is the testimony of the greatest solo sailor of the 19th century. In 1887, Joshua Slocum, the American mariner who would later become the first person to sail alone around the world, was shipwrecked on the coast of Brazil. Stranded with his family and no resources, Slocum built a 35-foot boat from scratch to sail them home to the United States, a journey of over 5,000 miles through open ocean. He was a master of Western sailing. He could have chosen any rig in the world. He chose the Chinese junk rig. In his published account, Voyage of the Liberdade, Slocum called the Chinese sampan rig the most convenient boat rig in the whole world. 7. The question nobody asks. If the Chinese junk rig is this effective, this safe, this simple, this battle-tested across 1,000 years of ocean voyaging, why does almost nobody use it today? The answer is speed. The modern Bermuda rig can point approximately 10 to 15 degrees closer to the wind than a junk rig. In light air and upwind conditions, the Bermuda rig is faster and more aerodynamically efficient. And for the last 100 years, the global yachting industry has been driven almost entirely by racing culture. The boats that win the America's Cup, the boats that grace the covers of sailing magazines, the boats that yacht designers stake their reputations on, they are all optimized for maximum performance under ideal conditions. Speed sells, trophies sell. Survivability does not make the front page. So we optimized for the sunny days. We built rigs that perform beautifully when everything goes right. And we accepted the trade-off that when things go wrong, when the storm hits, when the pin corrodes, when the sea turns hostile, the whole system shatters. The Chinese junk rig makes the opposite trade. It gives up those 10 degrees of windward angle. It will never win a race around the buoys, but it will bring you home. Closing. Let me bring you back to where we started. It is 3 in the morning on the Irish Sea. The wind is screaming past 60 knots. Somewhere out in the black water, a modern racing yacht has just lost its mast. The crew is in the water. The rescue helicopters are still hours away. And somewhere else on that same ocean, on a different night, on a different century, a Chinese junk is running before the same kind of storm. Its mast is bending. Its battened sails are reefed down to a narrow strip. The hull is flexing with the waves instead of fighting them. The sailor at the helm did not have to crawl onto a pitching deck. He did not wrestle with winches. He released one rope and the sail folded itself like a paper fan. He is not fighting the storm. He is riding it. And he will make it home. Because 1,000 years before the Western world decided that the only thing that mattered was speed, Chinese engineers understood something that we are only now beginning to remember. The point of a ship is not to be the fastest thing on the water. The point of a ship is to survive the sea. If this video changed the way you think about engineering, history, or the sea, hit that subscribe button and join Silk Road Annals. We uncover the forgotten technologies and buried knowledge of the ancient world, the innovations that shaped civilizations and that the modern world has quietly forgotten. Drop a comment and tell me, what other ancient technology do you think the modern world got wrong? I read every single one.